what I want to talk about tonight, at least to start, is risk. So when we consider the idea of risk, I think I have a fair bit of experience with risk. I've taken many risks in my personal life, right? I've done long Arctic solo canoe trips. I've done long expeditions with other people in remote and inaccessible places where you had to worry about everything from polar bears to Arctic storms to rapids to freezing to death to hypothermia, all kinds of legit dangers. I've also competed in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and submission grappling and in judo, and there's no shortage of injuries there. I've been a firefighter for the last 21 years, so I run into burning buildings for fun, entertainment, and profit. Also hazardous material scenes, so I've done quite a bit of that over the years. I might have a couple pieces of metal from the government, acknowledging that there were some fairly risky situations. Another story for another day. I've fought in full contact stick fighting matches where you're wearing a little tiny fencing helmet, a cup, maybe some lacrosse gloves, and unpadded sticks, and you're hitting each other as hard as you can. I have competed, or I have sparred young and steroided MMA fighters who are fighting at a very high level in the UFC, in Pride, in other events like that. I've used to do a ton of whitewater paddling, so in tiny little canoes, like 10-foot canoes, and in kayaks, and run waterfalls and class 5 whitewater. And so I think I've got a pretty good relationship with risk, which is funny because right now, because of the, I'll call it work, because of the work that I'm doing around COVID on the internet, I'm essentially being accused of being a coward. And so I'm actually a huge proponent of taking risk, or at least the individual having the right to take risks. At the same time, I'm very, very anti downloading the consequences of your own decision, your own risky behavior onto other people. So let me talk about this for a little bit. I sort of have some basic principles. I'm stumbling my way towards some basic principles around managing risk. And the first principle, I guess, is that you can take risks, but they have to be your own risks. You cannot take risks for other people. There's that adage that goes, my right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. My right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins, meaning I can stand and swing my fists around, but as soon as I start intruding upon your body and on your distance, your area, I have to take that into consideration. Similarly, when it comes to, say, COVID, if you want to move to a cabin in Alaska and live by yourself or live with a couple other people who have agreed to be there with you, you can do whatever you want. You guys have collectively agreed, consented to taking whatever risks of whatever activities that you do. But if you're living in a society and you're taking advantage of things like shopping malls, pharmacies, auto body stores, schools, libraries, supermarkets, grocery stores, emergency services, police, fire, ambulance. If you're taking advantage of the benefits of being in society, you have to consider other members of society. So we're not allowed to just do whatever we want. And when it comes to risk, yes, you can take personal risks. So I'm actually pro you driving without a seatbelt. If you that's what gives you joy in life, or if driving a seatbelt is a giant burden on you, I support your ability or your right to drive without a seatbelt, because if worse comes to worst and you go headlong into a wall or into a ditch, there's probably only going to be one person injured by that decision, and that's you. You knew what the risks were, and the consequences of you taking that risk fall on your shoulders. You end up bearing the consequences of your own actions. And that's cool, especially if you're, an intelligent adult and able to give consent freely and all that. Fill your boots. The example I keep on coming back to here is this idea of drunk driving. So there you are, you're in your cabin in Alaska, and for some reason, for some weird quirk of yours, you really enjoy getting drunk and driving your truck as fast as you can up and down the washboarded road that's basically only has you on it. If that's really what gives you joy, fill your boots. Go right ahead. If you wipe out and you go into a tree, if you wipe out and go into the lake and you drown, you yourself bore the consequences of your risk. So I support you doing that. What I don't support you doing is getting drunk and then going out on the highway, where I might be with my family, where other people are going to be, people who never consented to be part of your activity. So that's my first rule around risk, is that, don't take risks for other people. Now, of course, it's never completely cut and dried. If I go out and I decide to run some river in a kayak naked in the middle of winter and it's in total flood, yes, I could drown. I probably will drown. But rescuers who are coming to help me, they could also bear some of the consequences. So it's never that cut and dried. If I have a family and I go do something stupid and my kids end up being raised by some other person or go into the foster care system, they have borne the consequences or some of the consequences of my action. So it's not cut and dried, but as a basic principle, we're going to try and make sure that if we take a risk, that the consequences mostly fall on our own shoulders. I think that's not that controversial. And I'm just going to segue into COVID for a second. There are a whole lot of people who are like, dude, if you're scared, just hide under your bed. Just hide in your closet. Protect yourself if you're scared. I'm going to train. I'm going to do everything normal because I'm not afraid. That's awesome. But I'm going to argue that COVID is more like a drunk driving on the highway situation. In this society, we don't segregate the old. In this society, we don't segregate the people who are immune compromised. Immune compromised people have to go to work too. And old people have to take the bus too. And old people who live in old folks' homes still have to be served by younger people who live in families, who might be intergenerational families. It's impossible to stop the spread up and down the age ladder. It's just impossible. We don't segregate our old people. We don't segregate our immune compromised people. And if masks worked 100% to protect the wearer, which they don't, I would be in agreement with the people who say, if you're scared, just wear a mask. Unfortunately, masks are only partially effective. They're way better than nothing, but they're not 100% effective. And they're better at protecting other people. So that old person who's wearing a mask is actually doing more to protect you than it's protecting them from you if you're not wearing a mask. Once again, you have a right to take risks. I totally support your right to take risks, so long as the consequences of those risks fall on your own shoulders. I think I've explained this probably 500 times on my Instagram, on my Facebook, and on my Twitter, and in conversations over the past 4 or 5 months. And I'm just going to keep on going because I think it's a fundamental principle of ethics and morality. Now, another principle around risk that I think is valuable to consider is the idea of calculated risks. You want to make sure that there's a reason that you're taking the risk. Don't just take risks for the sake of taking risks. I mean, I had a brother like that. He would take risks, and he would take all the risks. And then he died in a motorcycle accident. Right? If he had lived for riding his bike, if he'd been a motorcycle racer, it would have been less tragic. He wasn't a motorcycle racer. He just compulsively took risks all the time. You want to take risks for a reason. You want to take risks to achieve a certain goal. A lesson that was drilled home to me in the fire department when I was going through fire officer training was to save a little, you only risk a little. Now, to save a lot, you might risk a lot more. The example here is if you pull up at a house fire and there's smoke pouring out of every window and flame pouring out of every window, you're not going to do an interior attack, or at least if you do an interior attack, you're not going to just rush in there. You're going to be very systematic about it. Why? Because the percentage chance that anyone is still alive in there is almost zero. It's almost zero. The odds of a savable life are minuscule. Hence, we're not going to take that risk. Smoke is super toxic. More in a fire, people don't really die of being burned. They die of smoke inhalation first. If there's black smoke pumping out of every window and flames coming out of every window, and the temperature's 1,000 degrees in there, the odds of a savable life, of anyone surviving, are almost zero. So ironically, we're actually going to slow down at that point. Now, if we pull up and there's a fire developing right beside the daycare and the kids are still in there, it's a bigger reward potentially. We are going to take more risks. We are going to take actions that inherently have a greater chance of going poorly, ending poorly, because there's a reason we're taking it. It's a calculated risk. We don't just go charging into every house fire no matter what, under any circumstances. It really depends on a risk to reward a risk benefit analysis that you have to do in the moment. So take calculated risk. Don't take risks for other people. Take calculated risks. The third rule, and it may be very related to this idea of taking calculated risk, is have a risk budget. Have a risk budget. That is, take risks if it's really important to you. Take risks where appropriate, but don't take all the risks. There's a big wave surfer who ended up dying while surfing big waves. His name was Mark Fu. And he went down in some surf and got probably pinned on the ocean floor and died. But he died doing what he loved to do. By all accounts, he was very careful in the rest of his life. He would drive like a little old lady, I heard one person describe him. He wasn't out there, going 150 miles an hour, on the Hawaiian roads as fast as he can while drunk. He didn't do that. He saved his risks for the things that were really important to him. In the COVID era, I would argue that if you're willing to take the risks of training, that's great. If you can find a way to insulate other people from it, that's great. That's not taking risks for other people. But then you have to be careful in the rest of your life. Don't go, dude, I'm training anyway. I'm just going to go out there and also go to the bars. I'm also going to the nightclubs. I'm never going to wear a mask. I'm going to hang around people who don't wear masks, right? I'm already committed. I'm already pod committed. That's a really dumb way of approaching it. Don't take all the risks. Take some of the risks. Have a risk budget. If you do something that's more risky in one area of your life, go less risky in other areas of your life, right? It's not you don't dial it up to 11 on every single dial that you have. If you go up on one dial, you're going to go down on another. So that's 3 rules so far. Don't take risks for other people. Take calculated risks. Have a risk budget. Another rule that I'm gradually developing here is acknowledge the worst case scenario, right? Don't just think of what you're hoping to achieve. At the same time as thinking about what you're hoping to achieve, think about what would happen if things went really poorly. And we used to do this kind of risk-benefit analysis, or this worst-case scenario analysis, all the time in whitewater paddling. Say there's a really fun little rapid, one that you wouldn't think twice about, of running normally. A nice grade 3 rapid, and there's a couple of nice moves in there. Okay, cool. That's a grade 3 rapid. But what if it's right above a waterfall? At that point, the worst case scenario is you screw up somewhere in the easy rapid, but instead of just washing out to the water below where you could roll up or where you could swim to shore, you're going to go over that waterfall and die. So as part of making that calculation for your risk budget, you have to think of what is the worst case scenario here. I did a ton of this on my 1,000-mile solo last summer. If I'm going up some rapids, right, you're climbing through the willow branches that are coming out over the moving water, and it's freezing cold water. There's wet rocks down below. Is that worth doing? Well, it depends what's downstream of you. If you slip and fall into the water, do you get washed into a giant logjam and die? Do you get washed over a waterfall and die? Do you lose all your gear and maybe die? Or do you just wash out in a pool below where you can probably, collect all the things that were spread all over the place in a yard sale? So you're looking at the worst case scenario. And now that I'm talking this through, really, you could put the idea of calculated risk budget, and worst case scenario kind of together. They're all very related. And so the 5th and final principle is have a backup plan. Have a backup plan. Know that if you're doing something risky, eventually it's going to catch up with you. Let's say you're doing something that's got a 0.1% chance of having a really bad outcome. If you do it once, you're probably going to be all right. Do it twice? Well, you're probably going to be all right. 3 times, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, eventually that's going to catch up with you. So just because I'll use the whitewater paddling example again, but you could use any of the dangerous examples. Just because you've successfully run a creek once with a little tiny life jacket, no dry suit, no wetsuit, no rescue gear, and you got away with it, doesn't mean you shouldn't be carrying that stuff. Really bad outcomes are rare. So you need to think about what happens when that one time when you have a really bad outcome or somebody else in the group has a really bad outcome. I mean, just like you wear masks in the modern day to protect other people, and they wear a mask to protect you, the rescue gear that you carry in your kayak isn't primarily for you. It's for your buddy. The gear that he carries is for you, and you're both looking at the worst case scenario. I mean, there's a couple of worst case scenarios. One is you go for a horrendous swim and end up wrapped around a rock, and they have to rescue you. And another is your buddy going for a horrendous swim and ending up wrapped around a rock. And I know that, if that happens, I want to have the kit to help him, because watching him die slowly would be a rather terrible outcome. So I think those are some useful rules around risk. They apply in many aspects of my life. I'm sure they apply to many aspects of your life as well. Regardless of whether you live for dune buggying or kiteboarding or doing jiu-jitsu or competing in MMA or firefighting or going on Arctic solo trips by yourself or getting married for the third time, whatever it is that you like to do that's risky, I think acknowledging that you can't take risks for other people, having a risk budget which takes into account the worst case scenarios and the cost and the benefit of risks, and the idea that you always need a backup plan, because no plan of contact, no plan of action survives contact with the enemy. That's an old military adage, and it's true. It's true on the fire scene. It's true in the jiu-jitsu match. It's true in the marriage. It's true in any risk-filled arena. No plan of action survives contact with the enemy.